Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. I recently received a number of comments and questions regarding the difference between woolen spun yarns and worsted spun yarns. Today, I'm going to answer those questions. When you select a yarn for a specific project, you might think about what sort of fiber you want to use. An animal fiber like wool or alpaca, a plant fiber like cotton or flax, a synthetic like acrylic, or a semi-synthetic such as rayon. In previous videos about yarn construction, I've talked about chainette and blown yarns, yarns that create asymmetrical stitches, and yarns with a Z-twist. I'll leave a link to the yarn playlist down in the video description. There's another yarn construction consideration, particularly with wool yarns, and that is whether the yarn is woolen spun or worsted spun. Today I will go through the process of how these two types of yarns are constructed. Then I'll discuss the differences in the resulting yarns, the types of fabrics they create, and how these differences affect texture and colorwork patterns. Finally, I'll talk about how you can figure out whether a wool yarn is worsted spun or woolen spun so that you can choose the yarn that is right for your project. Okay, in hand spinning we have tools that in some ways are very similar to what you would see in a yarn mill. So I'm going to use this to help demonstrate what's going on in the creation of a woolen yarn versus a worsted yarn. So in a mill, after the fleece has been scoured, you'll have these locks like this. And a lot of times they're kind of tight together at the very tips. And so we'll go through a machine called a picker, which will help to open these up. I'm going to use some hand cards here to kind of do that for me. Okay, so it goes through the picker and the locks are opened up a little bit. And then it goes into what's called a carding machine. So this is a hand carder that I use to prepare fiber. In a mill, the drums would be several feet in diameter and there would be multiple drums. I have two right here. And you'll see as I turn this crank, these are turning in opposite directions and they at different speeds. So the fiber gets fed in into this smaller one and then it gets transferred to the other one, and as they are passing each other, that opens those fibers up even more until they can be on that bigger drum. So in a mill, this series of drums would open these fibers up and transfer them from one drum to another until the fiber makes it all the way to the end of the carding machine. When the fiber comes off of the carding machine, it's going to come off in something, these like long, thin strips of fiber called slivers. And from that point, it can either be spun into yarn and become a woolen spun yarn, or it can be further processed by combing it before it becomes worsted spun yarn. So that is the difference, is in the preparation when it comes off the carding machine, whether it comes from the carding machine and then goes to the spinner to become yarn, or if it goes through a secondary process. So this is fiber that was created at a mill for hand spinners, and it's called roving. So it's carded, and you can see that it's kind of like this little mat of fibers. They're going in all different directions, and they can be different lengths, and they're just poking out in all different directions. This is called combed top. So what would have happened with this situation is that after it came off the drum carder, it would have gone through a series of combs, like these pins that are sticking up, and this would go through there and it would straighten out and align the fibers, and it would drop out the shorter fibers so that the fibers that remain in the comb top are going to be more uniform in length, and you can see that they're just all in parallel. when this gets spun up, it's going to create a much smoother yarn. The fibers are all going to be right next to each other, so the yarn will be denser per yard typically than a yarn that is spun from a woolen preparation. There's just a lot more air in the woolen spun yarn because the fibers are going in all different directions. So now we can compare the actual yarns that come out of it. I've got 2 fingering weight yarns here. This is a 2-ply Shetland wool yarn that is woolen spun. This one is from Jamieson and Smith. It's their 2-ply jumper weight yarn. There's another company called just Jamieson's, and they have a similar yarn that's called Shetland Spindrift. So this is a woolen spun yarn, and it has 2 plies. Woolen spun yarns, it seems to me, typically come as a 2-ply. There might be 3-ply woolen spuns out there. I haven't seen any, but typically they're 2-ply. This is a worsted spun yarn, and not only is it worsted spun, it is superwash. This is a Regia fingering weight sock yarn. So this one has 4 plies to it, so they're much thinner plies, and then there's 4 of them instead of 2, but they're the same yarn weight. This one is just very smooth, really not much of a halo. Sometimes you will see a halo in a worsted spun yarn, but this one just has a different feel to it than this one. This one just feels smooth, and this one, it isn't that it feels rough so much as it feels like there's more texture to it. So now we can compare what they look like when they're knitted up. So this is a swatch that's fresh off the needles. I'm going to wash this swatch and let it dry overnight, and so then you can see a before and after of this. I used the same needle size for both, a US 2, which is 2.75 millimeters. And one of the things that you can see is that the stitches in the woolen spun yarn kind of blend together. You don't see the separate stitches as easily as you can see them in the worsted spun yarn. In the worsted spun yarn, you absolutely can see every single stitch. It would be very easy to count them. The woolen spun is going to be a little trickier. I did a section of seed stitch in each of them as well, and again, you can see the texture in the woolen spun yarn, but it's just fuzzier. It's a more muted look to the texture pattern than it is in the worsted spun yarn. I'll do some footage of this after this has been washed, and then I will put those in a split screen so that you can compare the before and after. So this is an example of a worsted spun yarn that was knit with some stranded color work, and this is a woolen spun yarn. This is that Jamieson's 2-ply jumper weight yarn that I used for this hat. So this was fingering weight, and you can see that pink color there. This is worsted weight. That's not the same as worsted spun. Worsted weight refers to the thickness of the yarn. So this was yarn that was knit at more like 5 stitches per inch rather than something that was knit at probably 7 stitches per inch. But what you can see in this is every single stitch is very distinct in here. Whereas when you look at this one, you can see the individual stitches, but like when you look at the sheep, they all kind of blend together. So you get this blending of the stitches because when woolen spun yarn is washed, you get what's called blooming, and the stitches will expand into the spaces and they will kind of blend into each other, and you get more of what's called a painterly effect with stranded color work when you use a woolen spun yarn, where when you use a worsted spun yarn, you get very distinct separate stitches. Neither one of these is better than the other, but you might have an opinion about the project that you're working on, what kind of effect that you would like, and therefore which sort of yarn you might want to use for your project. Now here I have an example of 2 Aran sweaters. They were both knit with a worsted weight wools. This one was knit with a worsted spun yarn, and you can really see the cables. They really pop out, very visible on this. This one used a woolen spun yarn, and obviously it's very dark. Let me move the red one. Yes, the yarn is dark, which makes it harder to see the cables, but they just don't pop out of the fabric in the same way that the worsted spun yarn does. So again, it's not that it's worse than the other one. It's not that worsted spun is better, but it just depends on the kind of effect that you want. One of the things to know about a woolen spun yarn is that it is stickier. You will notice that as you're knitting, and because of that, because of the construction of this yarn and the fibers that are going in different directions, it has more air in it, so it will be warm. It will create a warmer fabric than a worsted spun yarn. Worsted spun yarns, because the fibers tend to be longer and more aligned, the yarn tends to be more durable, more resistant to friction. And therefore it tends to be more water and wind resistant. So again, it depends on the use and the aesthetics, which one is going to be better for your project. But this does tend to be stickier, and that also means that the woolen spun yarn tends to be you can work it to a wider range of gauges, and it will sort of the fabric will self-support. Whereas worsted spun yarn, there's a narrower range of gauges that it will work in. So if you tried working this at a looser gauge, because this has more drape than a woolen spun yarn, it doesn't sort of hold itself up as well. The looser the gauge, the more it will stretch out. So you just have more latitude with gauge when it comes to a woolen spun yarn than a worsted spun yarn. So if you are yarn shopping, how do you know if a yarn is woolen spun or worsted spun? Most yarn labels aren't going to tell you that. If you're talking about a basic yarn that has 2, 3, 4 plies, more, whatever, in most cases, it's going to be a worsted spun yarn if it has 3 or more plies. Woolen spun yarns, most of the time, are going to have 2 plies, but just because something is 2 ply doesn't mean that it's woolen spun. So another way you can tell is by the way it feels. And if you've never felt the difference, then what I would suggest is deliberately going out to find a woolen spun yarn, purchasing that, and then do some experiments with swatching so that you can see what it feels like, what it does to the drape of the fabric, what happens when you wash the swatches, what happens when you use it in texture, and then you get used to what it feels like, and it'll be easier to identify it. But if you are in a yarn shop and you find a yarn you really like and you want to know whether it was a worsted spun yarn or a woolen spun yarn, ask the clerk. Hopefully the clerk at a local yarn shop will know which of the yarns are woolen spun and worsted spun. It just depends on their experience with that. Hopefully there will be someone at the shop who will know that. Very few yarn labels will say that. This is Brooklyn Tweed Loft. It's a fingering weight yarn. This one does say on here that it is woolen spun. They have fingering weight yarn, the Loft. They have a worsted weight called Shelter, and they have a bulky weight called Quarry that are all woolen spun. They also sell worsted spun yarns, and their labels will say so. They have a really good website that explains the difference between them, is really clear about which of their yarns are which. Some yarn websites will tell you if their yarns are woolen spun versus worsted spun, but often they won't. There are 2 online databases that you can use to check for that. One is Ravelry's yarn database. Often there will be information about a yarn construction, what type of yarn it is, how, whether it's plied or chainette or whatever it is. And it will say if it's woolen spun or not. Not always, not 100% of the time, but most of the time. Another website is Yarnsub.com. It's a really good site if you're trying to make a yarn substitution or you're just trying to find out information about the yarn that you're looking at. It will tell you everything about its construction. If it doesn't say that it is woolen spun, then that means it is worsted spun. So woolen spun yarns are marked in there as woolen spuns, and then it will give you a list of yarns that are good substitutions for that. That's a few ways that you can tell. But I would say if you're not sure you have ever knit with a woolen spun yarn, go out and deliberately look for one, take it home and practice on some swatches so that you can get an idea of whether or not something is likely to be woolen spun. When selecting yarn for a project, think about what you want in terms of structure and drape, warmth and durability, and whether the item you're knitting has any support built into its construction. A seamless circular yoke sweater with a wide neck knit in a single color could work really well with a woolen spun yarn that holds itself up, while a superwash wool sweater might stretch out of shape and slide down your arms. Superwash wools tend to be worsted spun yarns, the smoothest of the smooth. They have more drape than even a non-superwash worsted spun yarn, so they aren't going to be much help holding themselves up at the shoulders. Yarns with lots of drape need help from the garment's construction, shoulder seams, for example, or a stranded color work that prevents too much horizontal stretching would be something to look for if you were to use a superwash wool. To learn more about yarn, books like The Knitter's Book of Yarn by Clara Park or Yarn Substitution Made Easy by Carol J. Sokolsky are good resources for learning more about choosing yarns for your projects. I'll leave links to resources down in the description. You can also check out my yarn playlist over here. If you have any questions or comments about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.